The first loaf appeared on the fence post on a Monday. It was a small round loaf of dark rye bread, still warm, wrapped in a clean white cloth and placed on the flat top of the post nearest to the tree line, as though someone had set it there on purpose and walked away. Oscar Bryn did not see who left it. He found it at dawn when he went out to feed the chickens. And he stood in his yard looking at the bread on the fence post the way a man looks at a thing that does not belong where it is, but that is clearly not an accident. He picked it up. He unwrapped the cloth. The bread was good. It was the kind of bread that was baked by a person who understood flour and water and time and heat, and who had been understanding those things for long enough that the understanding had become instinct. He ate a piece. He wrapped the rest. He looked at the tree line. He did not see anyone. He went back inside. On Tuesday, another loaf. Same post, same white cloth, same dark rye, still warm. On Wednesday, a different bread. A braided wheat loaf with seeds pressed into the crust, the kind of bread that required skill and patience and a particular knowledge of how dough behaved when you folded it over itself in a specific way. Oscar ate it. It was better than the rye. On Thursday, a small round loaf with herbs baked into it, rosemary and thyme, and the smell of it when he unwrapped the cloth was the smell of his grandmother's kitchen 30 years ago, which was a smell he had not encountered since, and which hit him in the chest in a way that bread should not have been able to hit a man in the chest, but apparently could. By Friday, Oscar had stopped asking who was leaving the bread and had started asking why. He was not a man who received gifts. He was not a man who had friends who would leave warm bread on his fence at dawn. He was a 61-year-old widower who ran a small sheep farm on the eastern edge of the village of Drywell, and he had lived alone for 9 years since his wife Bet had died of a winter fever, and in those 9 years nobody had left anything on his fence except the occasional cow that had wandered through a gap in the boundary hedge. He was lean and slightly stooped from years of bending over sheep, with white hair cropped short, a clean-shaven face that was more wrinkled than skin, pale blue eyes that watered in the cold, and hands that shook slightly in the mornings until his first cup of tea steadied them. He was, by the village's general estimation, a kind man who kept to himself and who was slowly becoming invisible the way old men who lived alone became invisible, by not being noticed until the day they were not there at all. The bread kept coming. Saturday brought a small flatbread with onions and salt that was clearly meant to be eaten warm, and that Oscar ate standing at his fence post in the cold morning air with his eyes closed because the taste was too good to experience with his eyes open. Sunday brought nothing, which Oscar noted with a disappointment that surprised him, because he had not realized how quickly a man could become accustomed to finding warm bread on his fence post, and how empty the fence post looked without it. Monday brought the rye again, and the cycle continued. By the end of the first week, Oscar had eaten 7 loaves of bread that were collectively better than any bread he had eaten in his entire life, including the bread his grandmother had made, which until now he had considered the standard by which all bread was measured. He had not seen who was leaving them. The bread appeared between 4 and 5 in the morning, before dawn, and Oscar had never been a man who woke before dawn, because his sheep did not require it, and because a man who woke before dawn without a reason was a man who was looking for something, and Oscar had not been looking for anything in 9 years. On the morning of the 8th day, he set an alarm. He woke at 4. He dressed in the dark. He walked to the kitchen window that looked out over the yard toward the fence and the tree line beyond. He waited. At 4:30, a figure came out of the trees. She walked quickly and quietly, carrying a bundle wrapped in white cloth. She was tall. Her skin was the green of deep forest moss. Her hair was long and dark and braided. She wore a long dark wool dress and a heavy shawl and leather boots. She walked to the fence, placed the bread on the post, straightened the cloth around it, and stood there for a moment, looking at the farmhouse. Just looking, not approaching, not calling out. Just standing in the dark at the fence with her hands at her sides, looking at the house as though she was trying to decide something. Then she turned and walked back into the trees. Oscar stood at the window for a long time after she was gone. He did not go to the fence until dawn. The bread was a small round loaf of oat bread with honey worked into the dough, and it was so good that Oscar sat at his kitchen table and ate the entire thing in one sitting and did not feel guilty about it because guilt required a reason not to eat the bread, and he did not have one. The bread continued. Day 9, day 10, day 11, day 12. On each morning, Oscar woke at 4 and watched from the window, and on each morning the orc woman came out of the trees and placed the bread on the post and stood for a moment looking at the house and then went back. She never varied the routine. She never came closer than the fence. She never looked at the windows, or if she did, she looked at them the way a person looks at a thing they know they cannot approach, with the careful distance of someone who understood that trust was a thing that could not be hurried. On the 12th day, Oscar did something he had not done in 9 years. He baked. He had not baked since Bet died, because Bet had been the baker, and the kitchen had been her domain, and the oven had been her instrument, and after she died, he had not been able to stand in front of it without seeing her hands on the dough. But on the 12th day, he stood in front of the oven, and he put his hands on the flour, and he made a loaf. It was not good. It was heavy and dense and slightly burned on the bottom because he had forgotten how hot the oven ran after 9 years of not using it. But it was a loaf. He wrapped it in a clean white cloth. He walked to the fence at dusk. He placed it on the post. Not the same post where she left her bread. The post next to it. 2 loaves on 2 posts. One from her, one from him. A conversation in bread. He went back inside. He did not watch from the window. He went to bed. In the morning, her bread was on her post, and his bread was gone. She had taken it. She had taken his terrible, burned, heavy loaf of bread, and she had left her own, which was a perfect round of sourdough with a crust so crisp it crackled when he broke it. She had taken his loaf. That meant she would eat it. That meant she would taste the burned bottom and the dense crumb and the slightly too much salt, and she would know that a man who had not baked in 9 years had stood in front of an oven and tried. That was the conversation. That was day 12. On the 13th day, she knocked. Oscar was sitting at his kitchen table at dawn, drinking tea, when the knock came. 3 soft knocks, spaced evenly. The knock of a person who had been standing at a door gathering courage. He set down his tea. He walked to the door. He opened it. She was standing on his porch. She was taller than he had realized from the window, taller than him by 3 inches. Her skin was the deep green he had seen by moonlight, but in the dawn light it was richer, warmer, the green of a living thing in sunlight. Her hair was long and black and braided with small wooden beads. Her eyes were dark and deep, and watching him with the careful attention of a person who had spent 12 days working up to this moment and was now standing in it and discovering that standing in a moment was harder than approaching it. She was holding his bread, his terrible burned heavy loaf, unwrapped from the white cloth with one piece torn from the corner. She had tasted it. She held it out to him. "You baked this?" Her voice was low and rough and careful. "I did." "It is not very good." "I know. The oven was too hot. The salt is too much. The dough was not kneaded long enough." "I have not baked in 9 years." She looked at him. She looked at the bread in her hands. She looked back at him. "I can teach you." Oscar Bren stood in his doorway at dawn on the 13th morning and looked at the orc woman who had been leaving bread on his fence for 12 days and who was now standing on his porch offering to teach him to bake and holding his worst loaf as evidence of why the teaching was necessary. He stepped aside. "Come in." Her name was Thalia. She told him while she stood in his kitchen and looked at his oven with the expression of a craftsman examining another craftsman's tool and finding it acceptable but neglected. She ran her hand along the iron door. She checked the flue. She opened the firebox and examined the coals from the previous night. "This is a good oven. It has not been used properly in a long time. The flue needs cleaning. The firebox grate is cracked on the left side. The door seal is worn. But the body is sound. This oven was built by someone who knew ovens. My wife's father, he was a mason who made ovens for the bakeries in the eastern cities before he retired to the valley. He built this oven as a wedding gift when Bet and I married. Bet was your wife. She died 9 years ago. 9 years since anyone baked in this oven. 9 years. Thalia looked at the oven. She looked at Oscar. "That is too long for an oven to be cold. An oven that is not used dies. The fire brick dries out. The mortar cracks. The seal deteriorates. You have been letting this oven die for 9 years. I did not know how to use it without her. That is understandable, but the oven does not care who uses it. The oven cares about heat and flour and time. Those things do not require a specific person. They require a willing person. Are you willing? I ate your bread for 12 days. I stood in front of this oven for the first time in 9 years and baked a loaf that was burned on the bottom and too heavy and too salty. Yes, I am willing." Thalia nodded once. She set his burned loaf on the kitchen table. She took off her shawl and hung it on the hook by the door, which was the hook where Bet's apron had hung for 23 years and which had been empty for 9. She rolled up the sleeves of her dark wool dress. "We will start with the oven, the flue first, then the grate, then the seal, then we bake." They cleaned the oven together. Thalia knew ovens the way Oscar knew sheep, intimately, instinctively, with the kind of knowledge that lived in the hands more than in the head. She showed him how to clear the flue with a long wire brush she had made herself from birch twigs and wire. She showed him how to patch the cracked grate with a mixture of fire clay and iron filings that would harden in the first firing. She showed him how to replace the door seal with a rope of woven wool soaked in water and ash that would compress into an airtight barrier when the oven heated. They worked for 3 hours. They did not speak much. The work did not require speaking. It required hands and attention and the slow, patient process of bringing a dead thing back to life. When the oven was clean and repaired and ready, Thalia built a fire in it. She built it the way she did everything carefully, with an understanding of how air moved through a firebox and how heat distributed through firebrick and how the temperature of an oven changed over the course of a firing. She let the fire burn for an hour. Then she let it bank to coals. Then she tested the heat with her hand, holding her green palm 6 inches from the oven floor and counting silently. "Now," she said. She mixed the dough. She mixed it on the kitchen table, which she had cleaned and floured while the oven was heating. She mixed flour and water and salt, and a small lump of sourdough starter she had carried from the forest in a clay jar inside her shawl. She mixed with her hands, kneading the dough with a rhythm that was so steady and so practiced that Oscar found himself watching her hands the way he had watched them in the garden weeks ago, with the attention of a man watching something being done perfectly. The dough became a thing under her hands. It went from a shaggy, rough mass to a smooth, elastic ball in perhaps 10 minutes. She shaped it. She scored the top with a small, sharp knife. She slid it into the oven on a wooden peel that Oscar found in the back of the pantry, dusty and unused. She closed the oven door. 25 minutes. They waited. Oscar made tea. He made 2 cups because there were 2 people in his kitchen for the first time in 9 years. He set 1 cup in front of Thalia. She took it with both green hands and drank it the way a person drank tea when they had been living in a forest and tea was a thing they had missed. "How long have you been in the forest?" 7 months. "Where were you before?" "A bakery in the town of Ganeth." "I was the baker, not the owner, the baker." "The owner was a man named Pollard, who bought me at auction 3 years ago and put me to work in his bakery because I knew bread and he did not know bread, but he knew how to buy people who did." "What happened at the bakery?" "Pollard died. His son inherited the bakery. His son did not want an orc in his bakery. He put me on the street. I walked. I have been walking for 7 months. I found this valley 2 weeks ago. I found the forest. I found a small clearing with the stream where I built a shelter and a small clay oven from riverbed stones. I have been baking in the clay oven for 12 days with flour I traded for at a farm 3 miles south in exchange for mending a fence." "You baked 12 loaves in a clay oven in the forest and left them on my fence." "I baked them because baking is what I do. I left them on your fence because your farm was the nearest to the forest, and because I did not know how else to introduce myself to a world that does not usually want to meet me. Bread is the only introduction I have. Bread does not have green skin. Bread does not have pointed ears. Bread is just bread, and people eat it, and for the time it takes to eat it, they do not ask where it came from." Oscar sat with this for a long moment. He thought about 12 mornings of finding bread on his fence, and about the woman who had been baking it in a clay oven in the forest and carrying it through the dark at 4:30 in the morning and placing it on his post, and then standing for a moment looking at his house and then going back. 12 days of bread as introduction. 12 days of standing at a fence trying to say, "I am here," without words, because words had not worked for her in the world she had been walking through for 7 months. The bread was your way of knocking. The bread was my way of knocking 12 times before I knocked for real. I needed to know if the bread would be taken before I knocked. If the bread was taken, The person inside was a person who accepted things from strangers. If the bread was not taken, the person inside was a person I should not knock for. The bread was always taken. The bread was always taken, and on the 12th day a loaf appeared on the post beside mine. A burned, heavy, too salty loaf made by a man who had not baked in 9 years. And I knew that the person inside was not just a person who accepted things from strangers, but a person who answered them. So, on the 13th day, I knocked. The oven timer in Oscar's head went off. He had been counting without realizing it. The bread. Thalia opened the oven door. The loaf was perfect, golden brown. The crust had cracked along the score lines in the way that meant the inside was soft and airy, and the heat had distributed evenly through the repaired oven. The smell of it filled the kitchen the way a sound fills a room, completely and all at once. And Oscar stood in his kitchen, with the smell of fresh bread in his nose and tears on his face, because the kitchen smelled like Betty's kitchen for the first time in 9 years, and the tears came without permission and without warning. Thalia saw the tears. She did not comment. She set the bread on the table. She cut 2 slices. She handed one to Oscar. He ate it. The bread was perfect. It was the best bread he had ever eaten. Better than the 12 loaves on the fence. Better than his grandmother's bread. Better than Bet's bread, which was a thing he had thought he would never say about any bread, and which he was saying now about a loaf baked by a woman he had met 45 minutes ago in an oven that had been cold for 9 years. This is the best bread I have ever eaten. This is a simple loaf. I have not shown you anything yet. There is more. There is much more. There is wheat bread and rye bread and oat bread and seed bread and herb bread and braided bread and flat bread and sweet bread and bread with cheese baked into the crust and bread with honey and bread with nuts and bread I do not have names for in your language because the names are in mine. There are 47 kinds of bread I know how to make. I have shown you one. Oscar looked at the loaf on the table. He looked at Thalia. He looked at the oven. How long would it take to learn all 47? Years. I have years. Thalia looked at him. Her dark eyes did the thing they had been doing since she walked through the door. The careful assessment of whether the thing in front of her was safe enough to stay with. The assessment seemed to reach a conclusion. Then we will start tomorrow. Today we eat the first loaf. Tomorrow we make the second. And the day after, the third. And after that. Oscar, there are 47 breads. We will be here for a while. He smiled. It was the first time he had smiled before noon in 9 years. They ate the first loaf. The days that followed were bread days. Every morning Thalia came to the farmhouse from the forest at dawn. Every morning they baked. They started with the simple breads. The rye she had left on the fence, which she showed him step by step, the flour and the water and the salt and the starter and the kneading and the shaping, and the scoring, and the timing. Then the wheat bread, then the oat bread, then the herb bread, which required a knowledge of which herbs released their flavor in heat, and which lost their flavor. And Thalia knew all of them because she had spent 3 years baking in a professional bakery, and before that she had learned from her mother in a clan village in the western mountains where bread had been made for generations. By the end of the second week, Oscar could bake a rye loaf that was almost as good as hers, which she told him was acceptable but not yet correct, because acceptable and correct were different standards, and she held herself and her students to the ladder. He did not know he was a student until she called him one. He accepted the title without argument. By the end of the first month, Thalia had moved from the forest to the spare room of the farmhouse. The move happened the way all the important things between them happened, gradually and without formal discussion. She had been arriving earlier and earlier each morning and staying later and later each evening, and one night she had fallen asleep in the kitchen chair while the evening bread was rising, and Oscar had put a blanket over her shoulders and gone to bed, and in the morning she had woken in the chair and looked at the blanket and looked at the spare room door and looked at Oscar and said, "Is the room empty?" "It has been empty for 9 years." "May I use it?" "The bolt is on the inside." She moved her things in that afternoon. Her things were a canvas bag with 3 changes of clothing, the clay jar of sourdough starter, a wooden rolling pin her mother had given her, and a small leather-bound book of recipes written in the Orc clan script that she had been carrying since she left the village in the western mountains. She put the rolling pin on the kitchen shelf beside Bet's old rolling pin. She did not ask if this was acceptable. She simply put it there. 2 rolling pins on a shelf, an old one made of maple and a new one made of mountain ash, both worn smooth from use, both the right weight. By the 3rd month, the bread had become something else. Oscar had begun selling loaves at the village market on Saturdays, which he had never done before because he had never had bread to sell. The bread sold immediately. It sold because it was the best bread the village of Drywell had ever tasted, which was not a boast, but a fact that was confirmed by every person who bought a loaf and who came back the following Saturday for another. Henny Millward, who ran the general store, placed a standing order for 6 loaves a week. The tavern keeper placed an order for 10. The village doctor, a man named Graff, who had once told Oscar that bread was the most important medicine, placed an order for 2 and refused to pay for them because he said the bread was a public health service. By the 6th month, the bread operation had outgrown the kitchen. Oscar and Thalia had rebuilt the old storage shed beside the farmhouse into a proper bakery. With a second oven, Thalia had designed herself from fire brick and river clay, a long wooden work table, shelving for the cooling loaves, and a small shop window facing the road where customers could buy directly without going through the village market. The bakery was not registered under a name because Oscar had not thought about names. Thalia suggested one. In my village, the bakery was called the Warm House because the bread made the house warm and the warmth made the people come. Call it that. The Warm House. The Warm House. Yes. Oscar painted the name on a small wooden sign and hung it above the shop window. The Warm House. It was the first new thing he had built in 9 years. The village had opinions about the bakery. Most of the opinions were good because the bread was good, and opinions about bread were generally led by the tongue rather than the mind. A few opinions were not good, because a few people in any village had opinions about green-skinned women that were not led by anything except the opinions themselves. Alderman Pollard, who was no relation to the bakery owner in Ganeth, but who shared the name and the particular smallness of spirit, had commented at the tavern that the village did not need an Orc bakery, and that Oscar Bren had apparently lost his judgment along with his wife. This comment had been heard by Henny Millward, who had been sitting at the next table, and who had stood up and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the tavern, "Alderman, I have been eating that woman's bread for 3 months, and it is the best bread I have eaten in 62 years of eating bread. And if you think I am going to stop eating it because you have opinions about the color of the hands that made it, you do not know me as well as you think you do." The tavern had been quiet for a moment. Then 3 other women at the bar had nodded. Then the tavern keeper himself had said, "The Orc's bread is the only reason my lunch trade has doubled since March. Anyone who wants to argue with doubled lunch trade can argue with my wife, who does the accounts." Pollard had not raised the subject again. The first year brought bread number 47. It was a bread Thalia had saved for last, because it was the hardest, and because it was the bread her mother had made only once a year in the clan village, on the morning of the spring equinox, when the clan gathered to mark the turning of the season. It was a round loaf with a spiral scored into the top that represented the year turning, made from a dough that included 7 grains and 3 herbs and a small amount of honey collected from mountain bees. And it required 14 hours of rising and a precise sequence of temperature changes in the oven that Thalia directed Oscar through step by step, with the patient intensity of a teacher who understands that the student is ready for the final lesson. The bread came out of the oven at dawn on the first morning of spring. It was golden. The spiral on the top had cracked open during baking in the way that meant the dough had risen perfectly, and the heat had been exactly right. The smell of it was not the smell of bread. It was the smell of 7 grains and 3 herbs and mountain honey and 14 hours of patience and a woman who had carried 47 recipes in a leather-bound book through 7 months of walking and 9 months of baking in a farmhouse kitchen, and who was now standing beside a man who had not baked in 9 years before she knocked and who had learned all 47. Thalia cut the first slice. She handed it to Oscar. He ate it. He closed his eyes. He did not have words for what the bread tasted like, because the bread tasted like something that did not exist in words. It tasted like the end of a thing and the beginning of another thing and the moment between them when you understood that the end and the beginning were the same. This is bread 47. This is bread 47. What comes after 47? After 47 comes the breads we make together, the ones that are not in the book, the ones we invent. Your grandmother's bread with my mother's starter, your wife's oven with my clan's timing, the breads that have never existed before because no one has ever combined these ingredients in this kitchen, in this oven, with these hands. How many of those are there? I do not know. That is the point. Oscar looked at the oven that his wife's father had built as a wedding gift, and that had been cold for 9 years, and that was now warm again. He looked at the 2 rolling pins on the shelf. He looked at the leather-bound book of recipes open on the table to the last page, the page for bread 47, the page that was followed by blank pages. Thalia. Oscar. You knocked on the 13th day. Yes. Why 13? Because 12 days of bread was the introduction. The 13th day was the question. What was the question? The question was whether the man who ate the bread for 12 days and then baked a terrible loaf in answer was the kind of man who would open his door to the woman who had been standing at his fence in the dark for 12 mornings, trying to find a way to say, "I am here," that did not require her to say it with words, because the last time she had said it with words, the door had not opened. The door opened. The door opened. They ate the 47th bread together at the kitchen table in the first light of spring. The oven was warm. The kitchen smelled the way it had smelled when Bet was alive, which was the smell of flour and heat and thyme, and the particular warmth that came from a room where bread was made by a person who understood that bread was not food. Bread was a language. Every loaf was a sentence, every crust was a word, every slice was a syllable in a conversation that had started with a single round of dark rye on a fence post and had grown into 47 breads in a bakery called the Warm House, and a woman who had knocked on the 13th day, and a man who had opened the door. The lesson was not in the bread. It was in the fence post. It was in the 12 mornings of standing in the dark, looking at a house, and deciding whether the person inside was safe. It was in the burned, heavy, too salty loaf that a man had placed on the post beside hers as an answer to a question she had not yet asked. It was in the understanding that some conversations cannot start with words, because words have been used against the person too many times. Some conversations can only start with bread, and the person who answers a loaf with a loaf is the person you knock for on the 13th day. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like. It helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. The Orc Keeper.